The morning sun rose slowly over the dry fields as a cowboy named Mason guided his old horse through the dusty trail with his loyal dog Scout trotting beside him. Mason lived far from the town and spent most days checking fences, watering his small herd, and helping any traveler who came across his land. He was quiet, but kind, a man who believed every life, human or animal, deserved care. Scout matched his nature, gentle, fast, and always alert to anything strange in the wide, open land. That day Mason was heading toward the riverbank to check if the spring rain had washed away part of the wooden footbridge. Scout ran ahead, tail wagging, sniffing the ground, as if he sensed something unusual. The air felt heavier than normal, and even the birds stayed quieter than usual. Mason noticed this change, and slowed his horse. He had learned to trust the land and its signs whenever the wind carried a feeling that something was wrong. As they approached the old bridge, Scout stopped suddenly, his ears pointed forward, his body stiffened, and he let out a low, worried sound. Mason dismounted, quickly placing a hand on the dog's head, and whispering softly, asking what he had found. Scout moved slowly under the bridge, sniffing carefully, and Mason followed, crouching low to avoid hitting his head. He expected to find a wounded animal, or maybe someone hiding from the heat, but nothing prepared him for what he saw beneath the shadows. 3 girls lay huddled together in a worn blanket. Their faces were pale, their lips dry, and their breaths faint. They looked like they had not eaten for days. One girl seemed barely awake, while the other 2 did not move at all. Mason's heart tightened as he knelt beside them. Scout whimpered and nudged the smallest girl, who opened her eyes just enough to see them before closing them again in weakness. Mason spoke gently, asking if they could hear him. The oldest girl, weak but conscious, whispered back with great effort, saying her name was Mira, and the younger ones were Lila and Hannah. She said they had been trying to reach town after running away from a dangerous place, but they got stuck here with no food, no water, and no strength. Her voice shook with fear and tiredness, and Mason could see she had been protecting her sisters as best as she could despite her own suffering. Mason knew they would not survive if they stayed under the bridge. The sun was rising, and the day would become very hot. He picked up the smallest sister first, carrying her out into the fresh air, while Scout stayed beside the other 2, licking their hands, as if telling them not to give up. Mason returned to lift the second girl, and then helped Mira to her feet. Though she could hardly stand, he gave them water from his flask, telling them to drink slowly and breathe calmly. Mira tried to apologize for troubling him, but Mason shook his head firmly, kindness guiding his actions. He placed the 3 sisters gently on his horse, one in front of him, one behind, and one supported in his arm, while Scout walked close, ready to help if anything happened. Mason headed toward his cabin, a small but safe place where he could treat their exhaustion. He rode carefully because they were extremely fragile, and even small bumps in the path made them wince. He spoke softly to keep them awake, telling them Scout was the best guard dog around and nothing bad would happen while he was near. When they arrived at the cabin, Mason carried the girls inside one by one, placing them on his bed and covering them with warm blankets. Scout lay near the doorway, watching protectively, as if understanding the importance of the moment. Mason boiled water and mixed herbs his mother had taught him to use when someone was dehydrated. He fed them little by little, making sure not to give too much at once. He wiped their faces with a wet cloth and checked their pulses, feeling relieved when he sensed a small but steady rhythm returning. Mira tried to sit up, but Mason told her to rest. He asked where they came from and how they ended up in such a terrible condition. Her eyes filled with fear as she explained that they had lived with a man who promised to help them after their parents passed away, but instead treated them harshly, never feeding them well and keeping them locked inside. Mira had finally found the courage to escape, taking her sisters with her, but the journey was long and they were not strong enough to reach the town where she hoped authorities would help. Mason listened carefully, anger building inside him, not the kind that shouted, but the quiet, heavy kind that settled deep in the chest. He promised Mira that no one would hurt them again, and that they were safe here. He checked their hands, seeing bruises and cuts that told the truth of their struggle. Scout gently placed his head on Mira's knee as if offering comfort, and she managed a tiny smile despite her pain. As hours passed, the girls slowly regained some color. Lila, the middle sister, woke up first, confused but calmer after seeing Mason and Scout near her. She whispered that she felt warm for the first time in a long while. Mason reassured her with a calm voice while offering another small sip of water. Hannah, the youngest, remained weak, but her breathing improved, and Mason kept a close watch on her, never leaving the room for more than a minute. Near evening, Mason decided to check the bridge again. He wanted to make sure no one else was hiding or in danger. He saddled his horse, but before leaving he told Mira that if anyone came near the cabin, Scout would warn her, and she should stay inside. Mira nodded, trusting him because his actions showed more than words ever could. As Mason rode back to the bridge, he scanned the land carefully, expecting trouble. What he found instead was something that troubled him deeply. Hidden footprints near the water leading toward the hills showed that someone else had been nearby recently, someone who might be looking for the girls. Mason studied the tracks until the fading light made it harder to see. His mind sharpened with determination. he returned to his horse knowing he had to keep the sisters safe no matter what. When he arrived back at the cabin he found the girls awake but frightened because they sensed something was wrong. Mason told them gently that they were safe for now, but he would stay watch during the night. Scout sat at the cabin door growling softly at the wind, as if expecting danger. Mira thanked Mason with tears forming in her eyes. She said no one had ever helped them the way he had. Mason quietly placed more blankets around them, giving comfort, without asking for anything in return. As night settled over the land, the cabin glowed softly with lamplight. Mason took a seat near the door, rifle resting beside him, and Scout at his feet. The sisters slept closely together, breathing steady for the first time in days. Mason stayed awake, listening to every sound of the night, aware that this was only the beginning. The girls had escaped something dark, and whatever they escaped from might come looking for them. Mason was ready to protect them, even if it meant facing danger he had never imagined before. Night settled slowly over the cabin as Mason kept his quiet watch at the doorway with Scout resting but alert near his boots. The lantern light glowed softly against the wooden walls, and the three sisters slept close together, wrapped in warm blankets, breathing deeper and calmer than they had in many days. Mason listened closely to the sounds of the countryside, taking in the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the soft shift of the girls as they moved in their sleep. The peace inside the cabin was a sharp contrast to the uneasy thoughts circling in his mind, because he feared the tracks he saw near the bridge were not random, and someone dangerous might still be searching for the three sisters. He knew he had to stay awake, no matter how tired he felt, for their safety depended on him. Near midnight Mira woke, quietly blinking around the room in confusion before noticing Mason still sitting by the door. She tried to rise, but Mason gently raised his hand, letting her know she should save her strength. She whispered to ask if he was tired, and he shook his head with a small smile, even though his eyes showed the long day catching up to him. Mira understood the weight of what he was doing for them, and it made her chest tighten with gratitude. She had never met anyone who cared without asking for something in return. She whispered to him again, thanking him for saving their lives, but Mason only looked away, as if the thanks was unnecessary. He simply cared out of nature, not need. Scout stretched a little, then walked over to Mira and placed his head near her arm. Mira stroked his fur slowly, her tired eyes softening as she felt comfort she had not felt for years. The cabin felt safe, like a place where nobody could reach them, and for the first time Mira allowed herself to relax. She soon drifted back to sleep, while Mason kept his steady watch until the early morning sun began to lighten the sky. When dawn arrived, Mason stepped outside to gather fresh water from the well. Scout followed him, sniffing the air and looking around with caution. The land was quiet, but the silence did not feel natural. Mason trusted Scout's instincts, and if the dog was uneasy, then something was indeed wrong. Mason walked around the area, checking nearby bushes, the grazing fence, and the ridge overlooking the valley, and though he found no new tracks, his gut told him that danger was not far. When Mason returned to the cabin, the sisters were awake, Mira trying to sit up while Lila supported her, and Hannah rested against the pillows looking weak, but better than the day before. Mason walked in with a calm voice, telling them they would regain strength slowly if they ate and drank water. Mira apologized again for being a burden, but Mason spoke firmly that they were safe, and he would take care of what needed to be taken care of. He prepared a small meal using what he had cooked: beans, warm bread, and a bit of honey, giving them small amounts so they would not get sick from eating too fast. As they ate, Lila looked at Mason with wide eyes and asked why he was helping them when strangers rarely did such things. Mason shrugged lightly, saying that sometimes the land teaches a person to care without thinking too much, and that no one deserves to suffer alone. His words were simple, but carried a quiet strength that made all three sisters feel a sense of trust they had not known before. Hannah, who had barely spoken since they were found, gave a soft thank you, making Scout lift his head and wag his tail gently. Mason asked them to tell him everything that happened so he could understand the danger and protect them better. Mira hesitated because speaking about their past hurt her, but she knew Mason needed to know, so she explained with slow, steady breaths. Their parents had passed away 2 years back, and the man who took them in at first pretended to be a family friend, but soon locked them inside his house, never letting them play outside or talk to neighbors. He used them to do work far beyond their strength and punished them when they made mistakes. Mira had waited many months for a chance to escape, and when she finally did, she carried her sisters through the night, hoping to find help in town, but hunger and exhaustion trapped them under the bridge. As Mira spoke, Mason listened without interrupting, his hands resting on his knees tightly as anger built deep inside him, a quiet anger that felt heavy and cold. He asked Mira if the man might try to find them, and Mira nodded, saying he never let anything or anyone slip from his control. Mason knew this meant trouble, and he needed to prepare because the man might already be tracking them. He stood up slowly, telling the girls that today they would stay inside and rest while he handled a few things. Outside, Scout barked once in agreement, understanding that Mason was preparing to protect their home. Mason stepped out with Scout and walked toward his barn where he kept a few tool supplies and an old rifle he rarely used. He checked the barn doors making sure they were secure, then examined the fence around the cabin, adjusting the loose posts and making sure animals or people could not slip through unnoticed. He filled a bucket of water for the horse, checked the path leading to the river, and cleared away anything that might make noise in the night. He moved with purpose, knowing that every step he took helped build a safer place for the sisters. While he worked, the sisters watched from the window. Lila whispered that she felt safe with Mason around, and Hannah nodded weakly. Mira, however, felt a strange mix of relief and worry. She knew they had found safety, but she also knew danger was out there, and she did not want Mason to face something terrible because of them. She gathered enough strength to stand, and quietly stepped outside wanting to help. Even a little. Mason saw her, and walked toward her, telling her she needed to rest, but Mira shook her head, saying she wanted to be useful. Mason softened his tone, knowing she had a strong spirit, but he still guided her back inside, telling her that protecting them was his choice, and she did not need to feel guilty. Mira sat quietly, knowing she had no strength to argue. While Mason returned to his work, Scout walked back and forth between the cabin and Mason, as if checking on both sides of the situation. Later that afternoon, a sound echoed from the ridge above the cabin, something faint but sharp like loose gravel shifting under a boot. Mason stopped moving, and Scout froze, ears pointed forward, searching the air. Mason lifted a hand, signaling Scout to stay still. He listened carefully, but the sound faded. The land went silent again, but not peacefully silent, in a way that warned him someone might be watching. He returned inside with a calm face, not wanting to frighten the girls, but Mira noticed the change in his eyes. He sat down and told them they needed to stay close to him for the next few days because he was not sure who might be nearby. He asked if they remembered anything that could help him guess how close their pursuer might be. Mira said the man was obsessed with control and would not give up easily. Mason nodded, realizing this could turn into a dangerous situation, but he had already decided he would not let anything harm them. As evening came, Mason cooked a warm meal for everyone, and the sisters gathered near the fire while Scout rested, but kept one eye open watching the door. Mason sat with them, sharing stories about simple things like his horse, his ranch, and how Scout once chased a fox twice his size and came back proud, as if he had won a great battle. The stories made the girls smile for the first time since arriving at the cabin, and the warmth in the room grew stronger than the fire in the hearth. But as night approached, Mason felt the same uneasy feeling return. He checked the windows, the locks, and his rifle, placing it near the door. Scout stood guard with his tail low, and his attention sharp. Mason knew something was coming, something that would test his strength and his courage, yet he also knew he would face it without hesitation because the sisters now depended on him, and he would not let fear decide their fate. The night grew darker, and the wind carried a distant sound that made Scout growl softly. Mason placed a calming hand on the dog's back, then looked toward the window, knowing that whatever waited beyond the trees was getting closer, and the real struggle had not even begun yet. Night returned with a heavier silence than before as Mason sat near the cabin door, listening to the wind move through the dry grass while Scout lay at his feet, tense and alert, with his ears pointed toward every small sound outside and his body ready to react at any moment. And the three sisters rested close together near the fire, trying to stay calm, even though Mira sensed that something dangerous was approaching, and she kept looking toward Mason, who tried to show a calm face so the girls would not panic, although inside he felt an uneasy pressure that grew stronger with every passing hour because he knew someone was out there watching the cabin from the darkness and waiting for the right moment to move. Mason adjusted his rifle quietly while Scout shifted beside him and gave a low warning sound as if telling him that the danger was nearer than they thought, and Mason whispered a soft command, asking Scout to stay ready, which made the dog rise slowly and walk toward the window, sniffing the cold air that seeped beneath the wooden frame, then growling softly like he sensed a stranger's scent carried on the wind. But Mason did not want to frighten the sisters, so he told them to stay close and trust him, because he would protect them no matter what happened next. And Mira pulled Lila and Hannah closer, wrapping her arms around them while her heart hammered with fear at the thought of being taken back to the cruel life they had escaped, and she looked at Mason with pleading eyes that silently begged him to keep them safe. Mason stood up, walked outside for a moment, and closed the door behind him, leaving Scout inside with the girls, and the cold air hit his face as he stepped onto the porch, scanning the ridge, the trees, and the rocky path leading from the river, and though he saw no movement, he felt the presence of someone hiding beyond the tree line, watching him with a hateful stare, and he clenched his jaw as determination settled deeper in him because he refused to let these girls suffer again. Mason stepped farther from the cabin, walking with slow steps so he could listen to the land, and he heard a faint rustling near the ridge, a small sound too heavy to be from wildlife, and he realized Someone was up there, probably tracking the cabin and studying the surroundings before making a move, so he returned inside quietly, not wanting the girls to know how close the danger was, and when he entered they watched him closely while Scout pressed against his leg. Sensing his tension, Mason told the sisters they would sleep together in the main room that night, and he would stay near the door with Scout, and even though he tried to speak with steady confidence, Mira noticed the slight change in his voice and knew the danger was real, so she told Mason she trusted him because he had already saved their lives once, and she believed he would do it again. Mason nodded, then set more wood into the fire, creating a warm glow that pushed back some of the fear, but could not erase the heavy feeling in the air. Even as the cabin filled with light and warmth, he stayed alert, listening to every creak and every whisper of the wind, and Scout paced in small circles, unable to settle because the threat hovered close like a shadow, waiting for the right chance to strike. When the fire dimmed, Mason placed more wood inside, then walked to the window, lifting a corner of the cloth covering it, and looking out into the night, seeing the trees sway under the cold breeze, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shape move near the ridge, a brief flicker of something dark, but it vanished too fast to confirm, yet the movement was enough to warn him that danger was inching closer. So he closed the window again, and took his rifle, sitting beside the door while Scout pressed against him, breathing heavily, as if ready to leap at any intruder. The girls watched him with anxious eyes, unable to sleep, because their bodies carried too much fear from their painful past, and the idea that the man who harmed them might be close made their breaths shallow, and their hands shake slightly. Mason noticed, and he walked over, kneeling beside them, and gently telling them that nothing would happen as long as he stood there, but he also needed them to trust him and rest, because their strength mattered, and they would need it in the coming days. Mira held his hand for a brief moment, grateful beyond words that a stranger could show so much kindness, and she closed her eyes, finally drifting to sleep, while Lila and Hannah followed slowly, their breaths quiet, and even Mason returned to his place by the door, determined to stay awake, but exhaustion tugged at him, and his eyelids grew heavy, so he splashed cold water on his face to keep alert and forced himself to stay focused. Scout lay down but remained awake, watching the shadows under the door and the windows as if guarding every corner of the cabin. The long night dragged on until a sudden sharp sound cracked the silence, the sound of a branch snapping under a heavy boot, and Scout leaped to his feet, barking loudly with a deep alarm that echoed through the cabin, waking the girls instantly as they clutched each other in fear. Mason moved fast, grabbing his rifle and leaning toward the window, but staying low to avoid being seen. He peeked outside and caught a shadow moving between the trees. Someone was indeed out there, and no longer bothering to hide, Mason whispered for the girls to stay behind him and stay low, and Scout growled fiercely, ready to defend. Mira trembled, holding Lila and Hannah close as they backed away from the door, while Mason stood firm, his eyes sharp, his body steady, even though his heart thumped powerfully against his ribs, because he knew this moment was coming. The shadow moved again, creeping closer to the cabin, until Mason finally heard a voice from outside, a voice filled with anger, shouting and calling Myra's name, telling her to come out and return, and Mason felt his stomach twist because the voice matched everything Mira had described, full of control, cruelty, and rage. Mira froze in terror as memories rushed through her, and she clung to her sisters, shaking uncontrollably, while Mason stepped forward, raising his voice with calm strength, telling the stranger to leave, and warning that the girls were under his protection now, and he would not hand them over no matter what the man outside threatened. The stranger laughed with a chilling tone, and took another step toward the cabin, as if daring Mason to stop him, and Mason tightened his grip on the rifle, ready to defend the innocent lives behind him. Scout barked louder, pushing his body against the door, as if he was ready to fight to protect his new family, and the three sisters huddled together, praying silently that Mason could stop the nightmare they had tried so hard to escape. The man outside continued approaching with growing rage, and Mason knew the time for talking was ending, and the moment for action was coming fast, as the cold night tightened its grip around the cabin, and the danger that hunted the sisters finally revealed itself in full, and now everything depended on Mason's Scout, and the strength of a promise he had made to protect 3 young lives no matter the cost. The night pressed heavier against the cabin walls as the angry voice outside grew louder, and Mason stood firm with his rifle ready, while Scout growled so deep that his whole body vibrated with warning, and inside the sisters clung to each other, trembling because the voice belonged to the man they feared more than anything, and every memory of pain and hunger rushed back into their minds, while Mason steadied his breathing and kept his eyes on the door, trying to judge how far the stranger stood by the crunch of gravel under his boots and the shadow that moved across the window frame as the man came closer, calling Myra's name with a rage that cut through the cold wind like a blade. And Mira shook her head, silently refusing to answer, because she knew that one word would pull her back into the nightmare she had barely escaped, and Mason whispered to her that she was safe, and he would not let anyone harm her or her sisters ever again, and Lila and Hannah pressed their faces against Myra's arms, trusting Mason more than they trusted the world outside the cabin. Mason stepped closer to the door and shouted calmly for the man to leave, warning that this land was protected, and he had no right to come looking for anyone here. But the stranger only laughed a long twisted laugh that made Scout bark even louder, and the man shouted that the girls belonged to him, that they were his responsibility, and Mason's jaw tightened because he knew that no child belonged to someone who treated them with such cruelty, and he answered with a steady voice that the three sisters chose freedom, and he would defend that choice with his life if needed. The man outside grew angrier, and the shadows outside shifted again as if he was pacing, searching for a weak spot to enter, and Mason kept his stance tall and ready. He was not a fighter by nature, but he was a protector by heart, and he felt a heavy duty inside him, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, telling him that this moment mattered more than anything he had ever done before. Inside the cabin, Mira felt her heart pounding with both fear and guilt because she worried that she had brought danger to a man who did not deserve it, and she whispered to Mason that she could talk to the stranger and make him leave. But Mason turned to her and shook his head firmly, saying she did not owe that man a single word, and she would not face him alone ever again because she had suffered enough, and now she had someone who believed she deserved safety and care. The man outside stepped closer and kicked the wooden door, making the girls jump and hold their breath, while Scout threw himself against the door, barking so fiercely that saliva flew from his teeth, and Mason quickly held Scout's collar, whispering for him to stay back, but keeping his own rifle steady and ready. The stranger cursed loudly, threatening to break the door down and drag Mira away, and Mason replied with a calm strength, telling him to think twice because this cabin was not an easy target, and he would protect the girls until his last breath. The stranger stopped for a moment, and the silence became heavy again, until Mason heard him step toward the side of the cabin, perhaps searching for a window or a weak wall, and Mason moved quickly to block the area, while Scout followed him, sniffing and growling as they listened carefully for the next sound. Mason whispered to the girls that they needed to stay low behind the table and keep quiet because the man was looking for another way in, and Mira nodded, holding Lila and Hannah close while they crouched together as small as possible, hoping the shadows would hide them. Mason walked toward the back window and heard a faint scratching sound, as if the man was testing the wood or planning to break in, and Mason shouted again, telling him that he was trespassing, and any attempt to force entry would end badly for him, and the stranger replied with a cold voice, saying he had dealt with stubborn men before, and Mason was no different. But Mason stood his ground, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened by the knowledge that 3 innocent lives depended on his courage. Scout suddenly dashed toward the back corner, barking wildly, and Mason rushed after him just in time to see the stranger trying to pry a window open with a metal bar, and Mason raised his rifle and warned him to stop and step back, and the man froze for a moment, staring directly at Mason with eyes full of hate before he snarled, saying the girls would never escape him. Mason repeated his warning louder and steadier, telling him to leave the land immediately. The stranger hesitated, then retreated into the darkness, but Mason knew it was not over. He felt it in the air, in the tension in Scout's stance, and in the way the trees swayed as if hiding a shadow that refused to leave. Mason returned inside and told the girls the stranger was still nearby, but they were safe as long as they stayed together and stayed calm, and Mira whispered that she was scared he might sneak back, but Mason placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, saying that fear was natural, but they were stronger now because they were not alone anymore, and Scout barked softly as if agreeing that he would not let anyone harm his new family. The hours crawled slowly as Mason kept watch, stepping from one window to another, while Scout followed every movement, alert and ready, and the girls sat curled together near the fire, drifting in and out of restless sleep, while Mason refused to let his eyes close even for a moment. Then near dawn Mason stepped outside to check the ridge again, and Scout trotted beside him, sniffing the ground and suddenly stopping near the bushes, where he found fresh footprints leading away from the cabin deeper into the hills, and Mason realized the stranger had left only for now, and he knew this meant he needed to protect the sisters even more, because the man would certainly return with more anger, and possibly more people. So Mason and Scout followed the tracks as far as they safely could until they saw the signs leading toward old abandoned sheds near the river, and Mason returned to the cabin with a heavy heart, because the danger was not gone, it was only hiding. Mason told the girls what he had seen, and Mira looked frightened, but also relieved that they had survived the long night, and Mason said they needed a plan to keep everyone safe because the stranger would not give up easily, and the 3 sisters listened closely, trusting Mason's words, because he had proven that he would stand Against even the darkest threats to protect them, Mason prepared the cabin, repaired the windows, set stronger locks, and gathered supplies while Scout guarded the door, and the sisters helped in small ways like carrying wood or sweeping the floor, wanting to feel useful and part of their own protection. And as they worked, a strange sense of family began to grow among them, something built not from blood, but from trust, kindness, and the shared will to survive the day. Passed in cautious quiet, but when the sun dipped and the sky darkened, they all felt the same truth returning, that night was coming again, and the danger lurking in the hills would soon come back stronger than before, and Mason knew the next confrontation would decide everything for him, for Scout, and for the sisters who now depended on his strength and courage more than ever before. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of red and gold as Mason prepared for what he knew would be the final confrontation, and Scout stayed close at his side with fur raised and eyes sharp, ready to protect the three sisters who stood near the cabin door, holding each other tightly while fear and hope mixed inside their hearts because they trusted Mason. But the memory of the cruel man still haunted them, and Mason looked at them with steady calm, saying they had survived too much to let fear break them now, and he promised he would stand between them and any danger that came their way as long as he was breathing. Then he checked the locks, the windows, the rifle, and the lantern, placing them carefully around the cabin while Scout patrolled the edges of the yard, sniffing and growling softly at the strange scent that lingered in the air. And when darkness finally took over, Mason ordered everyone inside and shut the door behind him, knowing the stranger would return soon with anger strong enough to destroy anything in his path. And the sisters gathered near the fire while Mason sat beside the door, and Scout lay across the floor like a living shield, and for a long quiet moment nothing moved except the flame that flickered gently on the walls. Then a sudden heavy thud hit the outside of the cabin, making Lila scream and Hannah cling to Mira, who struggled to keep herself calm, while Mason rose slowly, gripping the rifle, and Scout sprang to his feet with a fierce growl that filled the cabin with warning. The thud came again, louder this time, as if someone was striking the outer wall with a large piece of wood, and Mason shouted for the person to step back because the cabin was protected land, and he would defend it. But the stranger answered with a shout full of rage, telling Mason that he had no right to take what belonged to him, and Mason felt his temper rise, but he kept his voice steady and strong as he told the stranger once more that the girls were free now, and no one would ever own them again. This only made the stranger angrier, and soon Mason heard footsteps circling the cabin, along with the crunching of leaves and the scrape of metal against wood, and Mason realized the man had brought tools to break in. And Scout barked louder, moving from the door to the back wall, trying to follow the sounds, and Mason instructed the sisters to stay low behind the table and trust him while he checked each side of the cabin carefully, trying to predict where the stranger would strike next. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, until Mason heard the crack of wood at the back window, and he rushed there just as the stranger tried to force the window open with a rusted iron bar, shouting cruel threats as he pushed, and Mason raised his rifle, warning him again to stop, and the stranger glared at him with wild, angry eyes, saying Mason did not understand what the girls were worth to him, and Mason replied that no child's worth came from fear or control, and the stranger screamed with fury, but stepped back, only to move toward the front door, and Mason hurried after him with Scout racing ahead, barking bravely like a guardian made of pure courage. The stranger slammed his weight against the door, causing the wood to shake, and the girls cried out, begging Mason not to let him in, and Mason steadied his hands, breathed deeply, and shouted for the man to leave the land for good. But the man ignored him, and struck again, this time cracking the wooden frame slightly. Mason knew he had only moments before the stranger forced his way in, so he ordered Scout to stay close to the girls. Then he pushed a heavy table against the door to slow the intruder, and the stranger cursed loudly, threatening he would break the door no matter what stood behind it. The cabin shook again from the force, and Mason felt his heart pound with urgency. He understood that the situation could not continue like this because the stranger would not stop until someone was hurt. So Mason made a brave decision. He whispered for the sisters to stay down and not move. Then he lifted his rifle, opened the side window, and stepped outside, quickly closing it behind him before the sisters could follow. With their eyes filled with fear, Scout growled and scratched at the window, wanting to join him, but Mason ordered him to stay inside to protect the girls. Then he walked around the cabin, keeping low as he moved through the shadows toward the front, where the stranger was still attacking the door. The man did not hear Mason's steps because his anger consumed all his focus, and he continued slamming the door and shouting Myra's name, demanding she come out. Mason stepped forward and aimed the rifle upward into the air, firing a loud warning shot that echoed across the hills and made the stranger jump back in shock. Then Mason shouted that this was the final warning, and he would protect the girls with everything he had. The stranger turned toward Mason with fury in his eyes, raising the iron bar as if ready to attack, and Mason stood his ground strong as a tree rooted deep in the earth, telling the man to step away and end this before he forced Mason to defend the cabin. In a way neither of them wanted to happen. The stranger lunged toward Mason, but before he reached him, Scout broke through the weak back window frame and sprinted across the yard, barking with all his strength, and the stranger spun around, startled, losing his balance and falling backward into the dirt long enough for Mason to step between him and the cabin with a stance so firm that the stranger's rage began to crumble. The stranger lifted the iron bar again, but Mason shouted for him to put it down, saying he had already lost because the girls no longer feared him and would never follow him anywhere again. The stranger looked toward the cabin as if expecting Mira to run to him, but instead he saw 3 faces in the small window, pale and trembling, yet filled with a strength they had never shown before, and something in the stranger's expression cracked. His grip loosened, and the iron bar dropped to the ground with a dull sound echoing across the yard. He backed away, stumbling as he muttered angrily about ungrateful children, but Mason stepped closer, raising his voice, telling the man that if he ever came near these girls again, he would face the law and the entire community, because Mason would not let him hide behind lies any longer. The stranger glared, but fear finally reached his eyes, and he turned, rushing away into the darkness, disappearing among the trees, and Mason watched until he was certain the man was gone. Then he fell to his knees, breathing heavily as Scout nuzzled his hand with soft whimpers, and the girls ran out of the cabin as fast as their weak legs allowed, and Mira threw her arms around Mason, crying in relief, while Lila and Hannah clung to his sleeves, trembling from the storm of fear that had just passed. Mason wrapped his arms around all 3 of them, giving them a safety they had never known before, and telling them they were safe now, and nothing would ever take them back to that terrible life again. When the sun rose the next morning, Mason rode into town with the girls and Scout by his side, and he explained everything to the sheriff, who promised to find the stranger and make sure the law dealt with him, and the townsfolk gathered around, bringing food, blankets, and gentle words, because the sisters had suffered too long and needed a community to help them heal. And as weeks passed, they slowly grew stronger, living in Mason's cabin, laughing more each day, learning what kindness felt like and finding hope where they once knew only fear. And in time, Mason became more than a protector. He became the closest thing to family they had ever known, a cowboy, a loyal dog, and 3 brave sisters who found a new beginning under the safety of the same sky that had once held only fear and now held peace, understanding, and a future they never thought they would reach.